Hugh Emmett Wilson Sr. was a giant of a man. I met him in the summer of 1956 in Montgomery, Alabama, at a meeting of the Alabama West Florida Annual Conference of the Methodist Church. It was a hot and humid afternoon. In those days, all afternoons in Alabama in the summertime were hot and humid. No air conditioning, of course. The women wore dresses, the men wore shirt and ties. That's back in the days when people dressed up to go to meetings. And Brother Wilson stood in the afternoon session and requested the microphone as a matter of personal privilege. The bishop granted it, and Brother Wilson took the microphone. He was 80 years old at the time, and had officially retired, of course, many years before, but was continuing to work with a small church down in Daleville, down in the Wiregrass. It was a little community in which the Army had just established an Army base, a camp, Camp Rucker. And Brother Wilson knew that that area was going to expand. It already was. People were beginning to move in. And the little church, if it was going to be effective, had to have some assistance, some money in this case. And so he had come to the conference, the Committee on Missions, to request money to help revitalize that church. He made his request, and they had turned it down because there just wasn't enough money to go around. Most preachers would have let it go at that. Worked other angles, tried to do other things. But among other things, Brother Wilson was tenacious. So when he got the microphone, he told the story and said he had made his request, and his good friend Joel McDavid, who was chair of the committee, had told him there just wasn't enough money to go around. And Brother Wilson said, "I understand that. But I talked to the Lord last night, and I told the Lord that I wasn't going to sleep or eat or drink anything until this conference approved the request." And then he looked over at the bishop, and with that wry smile that he always had, he said to the bishop, "But the Lord told me I could smoke my pipe." And we all laughed. It would have been funny under any of the circumstances, but you need to know that, especially in the 50s, that smoking was a big issue among Methodist clergy. In fact, we all were supposed to take an oath that we would refrain from the use of tobacco in any form. But Brother Wilson had always smoked his pipe, and everybody knew it. So everybody laughed. And he continued to talk, and the bishop was ready to adjourn the session. He rapped the gavel, and he said, "Brother Wilson, you're out of order." Well, Brother Wilson also had hearing aids. He had one in each ear, and the wires came down to the receiver was kept in his shirt pocket. And Brother Wilson said, "What'd you say, Bishop?" He said, "You're out of order." He just reached up, took the hearing aids, put them in his pocket, and said, "They sure are, Bishop, they sure are." And of course we laughed again. I thought about while he was talking that I was then, and I still am today, that when people talk about talking to the Lord, I'm always just a little suspicious. But not with Brother Wilson. When he said he talked to the Lord, I believed that he and the Lord had conversations quite often. As the bishop was, he was winding down and the bishop was ready to adjourn the session, Joel McDavid stood up. And he said, "Bishop, I cannot speak for the whole committee, but I am calling a meeting immediately after this session, and I think I can assure Brother Wilson he'll get his money." And he did. A few years later, by this time, Brother Wilson is in his late 80s. He and Miss Betsy, his wife of 60 years, moved to a little community of Notasulga over in the eastern part of Alabama. They had a little piece of property that he had inherited. And his favorite thing in those days was after breakfast, he would go down and play dominoes with all the men that were gathered around the little country store there. Well, this is the time when you will remember the civil rights movement was beginning to heat up. And that was a topic of conversation, of course, among other things. And when Martin Luther King Jr. Started gaining notoriety, Brother Wilson let it be known that he was in favor of the civil rights movement, that he thought it was a shame, this whole segregation system that people had lived under for all these years. And when he said that, the men just completely ostracized him. He would still get up every morning, go down to play dominoes, but nobody would play with him. He was what I would call an uncomfortable presence. Some people might call it a witness. But he believed in the civil rights movement. His wife died. They had the funeral in Notasulga, the little church. Brother Wilson got there, walked up to before the service began, walked up to the front of the church, stood there looking at the casket, looking at his wife, and said, "Miss Betsy, I'm sorry we didn't have enough money for me to take you back to be buried among your friends. I'm sorry that I have to bury you amidst all these hateful people." I didn't go to the funeral, but I heard about it. And the people who told me about it said, and then he went on to name some of the hateful people in the community. Finished, walked back, sat down at the back of the congregation, and waited for the service to start. Hugh Emmett Wilson Sr. was a giant of a man. Probably never weighed more than 150 pounds. 5'9", 5'10", but a giant of a man. When he died, his son at the funeral was standing by the casket, and Hugh Jr. had inherited his dad's sense of humor. He looked down at his dad and said, "Well, Daddy, you always did say you were going to stop smoking." I've got more stories about Brother Wilson, including one where he actually closed down a chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. I've got so many that I'm going to have to wait and tell those later, maybe next time. Thank you for listening.